Today we are going to be starting a set of live sessions all about the English Civil War. And today we are going to be looking at the reign of Charles I. And we're going to be thinking about whether or not Charles I was fit to be the king. So he was the King of England. He was the King of England when we had the English Civil War. And we're going to be looking a little bit about Charles I today. So welcome to everybody who is joining us on YouTube. You can tell I've had a little bit of a break last week because I can't get my words out. Hello to everybody joining us on Facebook, everybody joining us over on YouTube. I can see lots and lots of familiar faces, so a huge, huge welcome to you all. I am fine, thank you. Thank you very much for asking. Although for some reason the camera seems to be flicking, which I'm not quite sure why that should be. So hopefully we'll cross our fingers and it'll be okay. So what we're going to start with before we move on is thinking about what makes the perfect king. It could be a queen. It could be a ruler of any type, really. But what would be the perfect king? Or the perfect ruler? What do you think? Hi from Joe King. So you've got King as a surname. So what do we think? What would be the perfect king? What do we think? Someone who's fearless and strong like Marie. Yeah, you've definitely got to be quite strong and know your own mind and a little bit fearless. Absolutely. What other ideas do you think? You've got to be clever. That's what I always think. You've definitely got to be clever. You've got to do good things. Absolutely. You've got to be clever. I always think it's so important that you have obviously intelligence, because in these days, the person that ruled the country, the king, just was born into that role. So they didn't necessarily have the intelligence and the know-how in how to be a perfect ruler. Someone who's open-minded and a good listener. Thank you, Hannah, William and Samantha. Someone who's brave, says Mia. Trustworthy, loyal. Jack says someone who's not power-hungry. We're going to come across that quite a lot, that idea of being power-hungry. Who's Marie? I don't know. It said somebody said that it was fierce like Marie. Fun. Someone who's eco-friendly. Definitely weren't thinking about that, Isaac, in the past. Someone who's decisive. So yeah, very, very good one. So I've got some ideas here, and I want you to think about whether you agree with them. So what makes a perfect king? Someone who defends their people from enemies. Yeah, it is a bit of a trick question. No one can be perfect, but we can try really, really hard. If you were the king, I'd like to think they would try to be really hard to be the perfect king. So defends their people from enemies. How important do you think that is? Yes, I know Marie. I know there's someone in the chat who's fierce called Marie. I don't know why people were picking on that comment above all, but I've mentioned lots of you. So yeah, how important? It's very important, is it? Particularly in this period of time when there were lots and lots of wars between Britain and France, for example, between England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland. So absolutely defending their people from enemies is really important. And we saw when we did the Battle of Hastings last term, we saw how difficult that can sometimes be. Upholds the laws of the country. Now, how important do we think that would be? Upholding the laws of the country. You've got certain laws. You want the king to follow the laws and make sure everyone's following the laws, don't you? I think that's very important. And I think it's really important that the king and his friends also follow the laws of the country. I think I think that's quite important. Some of you think it's quite important. It's good to set a good example. Why is it called a civil war? We're going to get on to that. We're just looking at Charles I right now. Yeah, you've got to set a good example. You've got to uphold your own laws. Ensures there's a clear successor to the throne. So we saw this was a good old problem when we got to the Battle of Hastings when we were looking at that last term. Usually it's an heir, usually it's a son or a daughter. But you need to have a clear successor, don't you? You absolutely need to have a clear successor. I think that's pretty important. Doesn't have to be an heir. I don't think that necessarily is the important thing, but you definitely need to have a clear successor. Yeah, because it's a big problem, isn't it, if there isn't one. Supports the church and the country's religious beliefs. So how important do you think that is, supporting the church and the country's religious beliefs? So again, if you've ever looked at the Tudors and you know, for example, all of the fuss that Henry VIII made, we've done that before, where he wasn't supporting the country's religious beliefs because he was a Catholic and the country was Catholic, but he wanted to divorce his wife, and so he broke with the Catholic Church. So we've seen in lots of periods of time that this is quite important to support the country's religious beliefs. And in this day, in the Stuart era, which is the era we're talking about, most people were Protestant and Christian. Makes a good marriage and allegiances with other powerful countries. So how important is that? Not marrying for love. We don't want any of that nonsense. We want to be marrying, the king needs to be marrying someone that's going to cause a good alliance with another powerful country. How important do you think that is? I find this hard because today we don't tend to make marriages based on allegiances, tend to marry for love. But in these days, I think it was quite important. I think it's quite important. Because then, you know, if you're friends with other countries because you've married into their royal family, I think that's pretty important. Right, consults Parliament to ensure decisions are in the best interests of your subjects. So you know that we have obviously a Parliament. Now, in today's society, Parliament has all of the control over how the country is run, and the king has no control how the country is run. But in the times of the Stuarts, it was the opposite. The king was completely in charge, but there was a Parliament there. And so consulting that Parliament, the Parliament represents all the people, is important. I think this is the most important because I think if you're born into privilege, you have no understanding of what life is like for normal people, because you're born into privilege. I mean, I couldn't even contemplate what it would be like to be a member of the royal family and all the privilege that brings. So I think this is probably one of the most important, that actually you need to understand that you are very privileged, you're the king, but you need to consult Parliament in order to ensure that everything you come up with, all your ideas, are in the best interests of your people. Make sure you balance the books and are good with money. Well, I think that goes without saying, that you shouldn't be spending lots and lots of money. And keep the country out of war, which I think lots of you have said is really, really important to you. What do you think the most important out of all of those is? Which do you think is the most important? So for me, I think the most important is upholding the laws of the country, because you can't expect the normal people to uphold the law of the country if you don't uphold the law of the country and make sure everybody does that. Clem, B and Connie, we're going to get onto that in a minute. So what we're going to do then, all of the English Civil War, you may not even know what a civil war is, and that doesn't matter right now. We're going to come to that during the course of this set of lessons. But what era we're talking about is we're talking about the Stuart era. So the Stuarts were a noble family from Scotland, and they ascended to the Scottish throne in about 1371, and they ruled all the way until 1714. So that's quite a long time, nearly 400 years. So they are traditionally a family from Scotland. They ascended to the Scottish throne in 1371, and they ruled all the way until 1714. Now, you might be thinking, well, it's the English Civil War, so why are we talking about the Stuarts if they were from Scotland? Well, it's because the Stuart family inherit the throne of England, which is what we are going to be looking at. Now, if you're interested in names, the name Stuart comes from the word steward, and steward kind of means if you're a steward, you're kind of somebody that looks after something. So if you said you were the steward of the earth, you would say you look after the earth. So steward is somebody who looked after Scotland, and that's how they got their name, Stuart. So these are all the Stuarts who ruled Scotland. We've got King Robert II and the Third, King James the First and the Second and the Third and the Fourth and the Fifth, and then we have Mary, Queen of Scots. Okay, so we have 2 Roberts, and then we have 5 Jameses, and then we have Mary, Queen of Scots. So we have a queen on the throne. Now, how do we end up with a Stuart on the throne? Well, the reason is because of Mary, Queen of Scots. So we've seen her here. Look, she is the Mary, Queen of Scots. She is the Queen of Scotland. She is often known as Mary Stuart. Now, please do not get her mixed up with Mary the First. Mary the First is long dead. Mary the First dies. Elizabeth the First becomes the Queen. So we have the Elizabethan era. And what we know about Elizabeth I is that she is a cousin of Mary Stuart. So she is cousins with Mary, Queen of Scotland. Now, what we know about Elizabeth I is that Elizabeth I didn't have an heir to the throne. She didn't get married. And so when Elizabeth I dies, there is no heir to the throne. Now, Mary Stuart is also dead at this point. And Mary Stuart has a son, and his name is James. So he becomes James the First, okay, of England. And this is because Elizabeth dies without an heir to the throne. Now, he was James the Sixth of Scotland, because they'd had 5 other Jameses before that, but he was James the First of England. And it's the first time that we have England and Scotland ruled by the same king. So James the Sixth of Scotland, James the First of England, it's exactly the same person, and it's caused by the fact that Elizabeth dies without an heir to the throne, and so James is the closest relative as the son of Elizabeth's cousin. And so James the First starts the era of the Stuarts. So what we're going to think about is we're going to think about what was life like under the Tudors and under Elizabeth I, and then what was life like under the Stuarts. Because we have James, and then after James comes Charles. And we're going to be looking at Charles in lots of detail during the course of these 5 weeks. So we are going to think that life under the Tudors with Elizabeth, and then we're going to think about what life became under the Stuarts, under this new ruling family of Scotland. So first with James and then with Charles. Okay. So with regards to money, we all decided that being good with money was really, really important. Okay. So when we were living under Elizabeth made sure that if she had any spare land, that she sold it off. And the reason that she did that is because she didn't want England to get into any debt. And she revived old taxes, which required nobles to pay for permission to marry and to inherit land. We have something very similar now. It's called the inheritance tax. She lived incredibly modestly. She didn't have big parties, but she lived quite modestly. And when she died, England wasn't in too much debt. So that's the first. That was what life was like under Elizabeth. And then when James I comes on the throne and he takes over from Elizabeth, he basically spends lots and lots of money. He has lots and lots of parties, and he gives away lots of titles to his mates. So Lord so-and-so and Lord so-and-so. He gives all of these titles, over 90 titles, away to his mates. And by the time he dies, England is really heavily in debt. And then his son takes over, Charles I, and Charles likes collecting paintings. So he spends lots and lots of the country's money on paintings, and he keeps asking Parliament, well, can I have some more money, please? And Parliament says, no, you can't. And so then he starts making up and bringing in taxes to make more money, which then upsets everybody. So what would you prefer? Would you prefer life under the Tudors with Elizabeth, or would you prefer life under the Stuarts with regards to how they deal with money? What do you think? Who do you think is the better rulers? What do you think? Don't worry, Finley. Are we all still there? Yeah, Rose says the Tudors. Isaac says the Tudors. Mia says the Tudors. Queen Elizabeth, living modestly, not getting England into much debt, and being quite fair with the taxes. She's taxing the rich with inheritance tax. The Stuarts, though, lavish spending, full of extravagance in their lives, buying posh paintings, and taxing normal people just to get more money. Right, let's think about how they deal with Parliament. So we said that when you are a king or a queen, you are born into privilege. And so you kind of need to be consulting Parliament to ensure that your normal people are looked after. So Elizabeth, during her reign, she held 10 sessions of Parliament. She asked Parliament for their support, and she respected their role, which was to approve any taxes. So if you wanted to raise more money as the king or the queen, you were supposed to ask Parliament for that. That was kind of like the rule, really. And so she asked Parliament every time she needed to approve a new tax. She gave really great speeches, which she knew would flatter MPs and show her support for MPs. So she worked really, really hard with Parliament. And then we have James, and James spends most of his rule arguing with Parliament. And he argues that he doesn't really have to ask Parliament for anything, because he argues that he has the divine right to rule, which basically means he argues that God has made him the king. And so he doesn't really need to ask Parliament. So every time he goes to Parliament and says he wants more money and they say no, he sends them all home and refuses to speak to them anymore. And so it's a bit petulant, but that's what he does. And then Charles does exactly the same thing. He basically goes to Parliament when he becomes the king and asks for more money. And Parliament say, no, you can't have any more money. And so he also says, well, do you know what? I have been chosen by God to rule, so you can just all go home. And he carries on raising taxes and doing what he likes, and he doesn't ask their advice for 11 whole years. So who do you think is the best at working with Parliament? What do you think? What do you think? Who do we think is the best person with regards to supporting Parliament? Yes, lots of you are going for Elizabeth. Jack quite likes the idea of Charles because they're artists, so you might get lots of money. But again, yeah, definitely the Tudors again. Yeah, she speaks with Parliament, Elizabeth, and she works with them. Absolutely. Don't think the two, James and Charles, the two Stuarts, are doing very well, are they? Right, let's think about war. So we talked really importantly about how defending a country in war is really important. So let's see. So we know Elizabeth defeated the Spanish Armada, so the Spaniards attempt to invade England. And throughout her life, she avoided large wars. So she gave limited support where she had to give support. So there was a conflict in the Netherlands. She gave limited support. But she really tried hard to avoid wars. And she also, one of the arguments as to why she didn't marry was because she didn't want to then be dragging England into a war. Because, of course, if you marry, for example, the King of Spain, then and Spain wants to go to war with the country, you have to obviously support that war with your troops because you're married to the King of Spain. So one of the arguments as to why she didn't marry is because she wanted to keep England out of war. James made peace with Spain when he became the king because there was still a long-standing hatred between Spain and England. So James made peace with Spain and he tried, but he failed to arrange a marriage between his son Charles and a Spanish princess to make sure England was never dragged into a major war. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. When Charles becomes king, he enters a war with Spain very quickly, which ends in disaster. He then goes to war with France, but that also fails again. He then goes to war with Scotland and the Scottish Church, even though he's the King of Scotland. Lots of people in Scotland rebel against him because he says that he wants an English prayer book used in Scotland. And all of these things cost money that England didn't have. Now, this is a hard one. Out of the three, who do you think did a good job and who didn't do a good job? Because I don't think this is quite choosing the Tudors versus the Stuarts, this one. This is a little bit more tricky. Who did a good job or who did the best job? So I would argue James did the best job because James called a peace with Spain. And never led England into a major war. Both the others did. Elizabeth angered Spain because a lot of her sailors would steal from Spanish ships. And of course, she refused to marry the King of Spain. But she was kind of all right. Charles I, absolutely horrendous, wasn't he, with all of those wars? So that one's a little bit more tricky. Right, how did they deal with the public? So we're talking about, like, you know, people like us. How did they deal with the public? So Elizabeth travelled all around England so people could come out to see her. She went on what she called her summer progress, which basically meant that she went round and visited lots of various people, various nobles in their homes, and she made herself very, very visible to normal people. And she tried, obviously, as well, to kind of keep this middle way in religion. So saying to people, you know, as long as you're doing what you want and you're doing it quietly, you know, you can carry on worshipping who you like. With regards to James, he was quite an awkward person. He wasn't hated by the public, but he was just quite an awkward person. I mean, you can't apologise for that. He was distrusted by the English because he had a thick Scottish accent. He did use fairly harsh punishments if people spoke up against him. He favoured branding, which is where you burn initials into people's skin. So he wasn't like, he did have some not very nice side to him, but he was quite awkward. He wasn't particularly popular. Charles rarely appeared in public, so he was always seen as completely distant. He had a Catholic wife who was called Henrietta Maria, and so because his wife was a Catholic, England was Protestant, he was never really seen. People just didn't like him. They thought he was secretive. They thought he was a bit backhanded. People didn't really trust him. And he tried to arrest 5 MPs in Parliament in 1642 because he said that was rebelling against him. So he just wasn't really very popular at all. So who do you think is going to be the winner here? It's definitely the Tudors. It's definitely Elizabeth, isn't it? She was really popular. And that's something that I don't think the other 2 kings thought about. You have to be seen by the people, and people need to like you. Right, marriage. So Elizabeth never marries, as we know, and she leaves her country without any sort of heir to the throne. So it causes this succession crisis. James marries Anne of Denmark and tries to marry Charles to this Spanish princess, although it does fail. And he believed very much that you need to get married and have an heir. So that was James's idea. And then Charles married Henrietta Maria. She was a Catholic princess from France. It wasn't particularly popular because lots of people mistrusted her. However, they had lots and lots of children. So there was lots of choice for an heir to the throne. Am I freezing for anybody else has just come up? I hope not. Yeah, Elizabeth the first was the best. James wasn't that bad because he was awkward. Yeah, I agree. Now, on this front, yeah, I always think, Clem, being Connie, that idea Elizabeth was married to her country is a bit of a cop-out. Like, ultimately, you're the Queen of England. You need to have an heir to the throne. So the winner, really, is the Stuarts. And the loser on this one is the Tudors. Elizabeth never marries. James, has children, has a clear heir to the throne. Charles marries, although his wife isn't liked. And so but they have lots of children, so lots of heirs to the throne. So it's definitely not the Tudors. Not see a vote for the Tudors. It's definitely not the Tudors. It's boo to Elizabeth for this one. She should have got married and had an heir to the throne. The Stuarts definitely win on this front. So imagine, I thought this was quite fun because we don't have these because we home ed. But, when you go to school, or if you've ever been to school, or you might not know, but they give you like a report card at the end of school, at the end of your school year. Mine always said Chrissy talks too much and doesn't pay enough attention. But you do we're going to just imagine if we were teachers and we were going to give a report card to Elizabeth, what grade would you give her? So an A grade would be she was like completely awesome on every level. An F grade would be like she was dreadful. But you can have A, B, C, D, E, or F. And like, what would you say about her? What would you say about her? So for me, it always said Chrissy talks too much and doesn't pay attention. What would you give her? Oh yeah, it's a typo. I've written Elixabeth. Elizabeth. So a B plus. Yeah, pretty good. I think she worked hard, tried hard. An A. Pretty good. An A minus. Oh, I don't know if I said about pluses and minuses. An A minus. A C plus. A B plus. Yeah, she should have married an A-. So we're thinking she's pretty good. Rocco says B. So the lowest grade she's got is a C. Right, what about Charles the First? What grade would you give him? Could have done better, should have married, would have been what the report card should have said to Elizabeth. What are we going to go for Charles? What do we reckon? An F. So many Fs. F, 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 F. E. A D. F. A C. Oh, an F. What would you put on his card? What would you say about his card? So well done on getting married. However, really bad with money. Don't listen to Parliament. An equal reckons an E. A little bit too arrogant. Yeah, you could put that. D, well done on getting married and having children. Yeah, lots of go for kind of Fs. Yeah, stop partying, Charlie, and stop being argumentative and focus on running the country. Although, Jack, I would say a C- is very, very positive. Yeah, not everything works when he tries. Could be a bit friendlier. Yeah, you could say maybe be a bit friendlier. Yeah, lots of ideas on the school report card. I thought that was a little bit of fun. So who would you prefer to be ruled by? Well, it's definitely a unanimous vote. You would all choose Elizabeth. You've all pretty much said that F for Charles. There's not. I think you. Well, that's harsh. There's nothing good about you, Charles. F minus 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 minus. I think if you got that in a school report, you might cry. But yeah, I think it's a unanimous vote that we would rather be ruled by Elizabeth than Charles the First. So was he fit to be king? Is the question we're kind of thinking of. And that's what we're going to be looking at next week. We're going to look at his reign a little bit more because, of course, he kicks off a massive war. Now, somebody said to me very early on the chat, what is a civil war? Well, a civil war is a war fought within your own country. So it's not like a war between England and France or France and Spain or something like that. It's a war between people within the same country. So Charles I is the only king who caused a civil war within England to happen, where two different parts of, two different views. So obviously there were people that supported the king, people who didn't, and people from the same country went to war with each other. So next week, we're going to be thinking a little bit more about his fitness to be king, because I've just kind of introduced it today. But my question for you is, what would you do? So if you wanted money from Parliament, and you really desperately need funds to keep everything running, and Parliament won't give you the money, what would you do? And also, if you'd married Henrietta Maria because you'd fallen in love with her, and you think she's kind and lovely, but the people don't like her because she's a Catholic, I mean, what would you do? You've strengthened ties with France because you've married a French princess, so you're going to avoid a war with France. But people don't like her, but you love her. Like, what would you do? And, you really want Scotland to follow this new prayer book. You believe the whole country should worship in the same way. You are the King of Scotland, and Scotland don't want to do what you're saying. But what should you do? If you want, that's your belief that everybody should be worshipping the same way. What can you do if they won't do it? And then if you hear 5 members of Parliament are secretly plotting against you, and you believe that you've been chosen by God to rule, what are you going to do other than arrest them? So we're going to look at this in lots more detail next week, because it's really easy to almost take what I would call a pantomime approach and go, boo, you're really rubbish. But as I said, Parliament wouldn't give him money. He was in love with Henrietta Maria. It's kind of not his fault that she was a Catholic. He wanted the whole of England and Scotland to follow the same prayer book, so there was consistency. And 5 members of Parliament were plotting against him, and he caused a massive hoo-ha by arresting them. Like, what would you do? Was there any other views? So it's a really, really hard one. So it's not that easy. Hang on, Alicia, we're not going yet. So we're going to look at that next week. But what we're going to finish with is a bit of a fun game. It's called Crown or Clown. So I'm going to give you a fact about Charles. And you are going to decide whether or not it's true, at which point it's a crown, or whether you think it's a clown, whether you think I'm just making it up. So the first one, crown or clown, Charles I was only 4 foot 8 inches tall. So Charles I was only 4 foot 8 inches tall. Do you think that's true, crown, or do you think I'm clowning around and that's a pile of rubbish? Pretty much everyone's going for clown. Okay. Are we ready? Totally everybody thinks it's clown. Apart from Clem B and Connie that say it's so ridiculous, I think it's true. It is true. There are some suggestions that he might have been as tall as 5'1". So there have been, his head was embalmed, and so they have sort of measured around later on in his, like after he passed away, they did sort of measure around the top of his head and then work out that he might have been about 5'1". But most people, historians, believe that he was 4 foot 8, which is tiny, and I bet lots of you are even taller than that. Right, next one, crown or clown. Charles I owned one of the most valuable art collections in Europe. That's pretty big, to own one of the most valuable art collections in Europe. Surely museums would be earning one of the most valuable art collections in Europe. Do we think that's crown, or do we think that's clown? Oh, lots of you going for crown. We know he liked collecting paintings. It absolutely is true. So I'll tell you how much money he spent on art, because he owned one of the most valuable art collections in the whole of Europe. Charles I could speak 3 languages by the time he was 15. Do you think that's crown and true, or do you think that's clown? That's a lot of languages to be able to speak by the time you're 15. Do we think that he could speak 3 languages by the time he was 15? Lots of you thinking, or a couple of you thinking it's true. Mia thinks it's not true. Rocco thinks it's not true. This one's splitting opinion. Oh, I think more people think it's false. It is false, but it's possibly false for probably not what you realise. He could actually speak 4 languages by the time he was 15. So Jack's got that one. He could speak English, French, Latin, and Spanish. So he could speak 4 languages by the time he was 15, which I think is pretty incredible. Charles I had a talking pet raven. So a raven is like a very big crow. They have them in the Tower of London, if you've ever been there. But Charles I had a talking pet raven. Do we think that's true, or do we think that's a total pile of rubbish? What do we think? True, or a clowning around rubbish? Joe can speak Spanish. Well done. Right, we're going for clown. Couple of crowns. Eleanor thinks it's true. Clown. It's true, he did. So ravens are incredibly clever. When I say talking pet raven, we're probably talking a little bit like a parrot. So they kind of repeat what you say. I'm not suggesting, that they've sat and had a conversation about taxation or the state of the weather. They repeat words. That you can teach them to repeat words, a bit like a parrot. They're really super duper clever. All corvids are. So crows, rooks, ravens. And yes, Charles I had a pet raven. Right. Charles I believed he could cure people of diseases just by touching them. What do you reckon? So Charles I believed he could cure people of diseases just by touching them. What do we think? True, 100%. True, says Jack. Philly says rubbish. Bo thinks it's true. Rocco thinks it's true. Absolutely is true. So this idea, because if you believe you've been given the right to rule by God, then you believe, you're almost like God's representative on earth. And so therefore, absolutely, Charles I and his brother and his father both believed that they could cure people by touching them. So that's it from me. Hopefully, I want you to start thinking about what would you do, because it's we're not going to go for the pantomime. Boo, he was totally useless. We're going to look a little bit more next week about how Charles I kicked off the English Civil War. So start to think about, was he kind of, what were his problems, but actually what would you have done in those situations? Do head over to our blog. It's linked in the description below or to the side of this video. And do click on it. Do go and see some of the great activities that I've written for you. And yeah, I will see you next week. But yeah, definitely click on the blog, click through to the website, have a little look at some of the activities and resources I've got for you. I will see you next week, when we're going to look a little bit more about Charles I and the start of the cause of the English Civil War, like what actually kicked it all off. Have a lovely week, and I will see you soon. And thank you for all the goodbyes. I'll see you soon.